All right, let's try this again. Hopefully, y'all can hear me now. I apologize for that. Welcome back to the EOS Phoenix channel. It is November 21st. I hope everybody's having a fabulous day and a huge day in the crypto world, or huge month, I should say. Just total transformation that we've seen with adoption and really the cyber hornets coming out to play and making the case really across the world. So if you like this content, consider hitting that like button, consider subscribing to this channel. If you have a comment, want to chat about something, drop it in the chat. We're going to get into the EOS news as well. Um, but it's just been really an interesting, I would say, couple weeks. Most recently, we've also seen from the likes of the comptroller and Hester Pierce jointly making I think it was a presentation to a group of lawyers, and see if we can find a link and leave it in the description below, in which they seemingly admitted in a way that the United States is about 4 years behind in terms of innovation and in terms of a digital currency being competitive with China. And so there seemed to be some realization that there were two paths that the United States could basically take. One path was to be 4 years behind and let the United States government create a monopolized central digital currency, US dollar. The other approach was to have the free market, through these United States stable tokens that already exist, go ahead and leverage that across the world, right, to compete against China. And so there was some discussion also about Bitcoin, and that I found that interesting, as well as allowing the developers in the United States to start to compete against the likes of developers in China. So to me, that's very positive. And another thing that was mentioned is recognition of a need to probably change the tax laws. And so these aren't things that you guys are hearing perhaps in the mainstream, but they are out there. They are out there. I do look for them, and that's what I'm here to report to you guys on. If you have an interest in learning more about that, I think I also dropped the link in the Gang channel, or the Resident Alien type EOS channel that we have. And I just dropped very interesting links in there that I find to share with you guys. So I'd like to know what you guys think about that. I mean, if there's generally this recognition that the government needs to be more favorable to innovators here, that could really open up opportunities for companies like Block One, but also other developers really across the blockchain space, whether it's Bitcoin, Ethereum, EOS, Litecoin, to really start to introduce these smart contract type applications, because that's been really I think the hindrance on unleashing a lot of this stuff is just the regulatory uncertainty. And so maybe in 2021 we'll see a lot more about that. In terms of the price itself, guys, if you watch my recent videos, I was sort of expecting this range between, I think it was a $9,000 range to a $12,000 range. I had no idea it would actually move this fast, and I'm not personally convinced that will just remain and go straight up. So this is great, but I think it's also comes at a backdrop potentially of a slowdown in the overall economy. And so it'll be interesting to see in 2021 if we'll continue to see this rapid uh, ascension in price and adoption and interest, or if we'll sort of taper off. But what I tend to do, and what I've always tried to advise here, even though it's not investment advice, what I do personally is I dollar cost average, and that helps me over a long period of time, like over 8 years, being within the Bitcoin space. Since learning about this from the likes of like Max Kaiser, that has seemed to done very well in just minimizing the risk and volatility in the space. So it's something I always share here. In terms of EOS, one of the most recent things, if you haven't been paying attention and you still are interested in EOS at this point, given all the FUD recently in the community, has been Google's BP. If you remember my last video, I mentioned that they had publicized an interest to become a block producer on the EOS mainnet. And so since then, we've seen the Google BP entity move up in rankings to the point now where they're in a paid position. So it's just one small milestone of improvement from where they were before. Because prior to that, I think they were still in the process of understanding the technical requirements with running, um, basically becoming a BP on the EOS mainnet. And so now you're actually seeing them in a position where they may actually start to move up further in the rankings and get into the top 21. And that's pretty significant, guys, because the other thing that was the other thing that was recognized in the video that I watched with Hester Pierce and the Office of the Comptroller Brian Brooks was this realization that the United States is falling behind, not only in terms of adoption of currency such as Bitcoin and even digital stable coins, but also just the adoption of it. And so one of the things that was also cited is just the control of these networks. So, in Bitcoin, you have the hash wars, right? And so, what we're seeing right now is over 50% of the hash power is essentially in China. And there seems to be, and I've talked about this in my previous videos, a realization of a Sputnik moment, right? Where you have different countries that realize that this is somewhat of a war. It's a different kind of a war, whereas maybe in the past there was tanks and planes and missiles. Now we're in an information digital war, and so it's a different kind of asymmetric warfare that's going on. And with a country like China basically able to control more than 50% of the Bitcoin network, they hold a huge percentage of the influence in that system, and potentially it could be characterized, as was discussed in this video, as a national security item for the United States. And so the only way to, I guess, fight back against that or to compete against that is to actually have engineers and innovators here in this country start to develop their mining farms and their computing technology and their miners, right? So that it is somewhat of an equal playing field, or it's at least a competitive playing field in that, especially as Bitcoin just continues to make and prove its case as a digital store of value, similar and to eclipse the likes of an asset like gold or silver or those assets combined. And so um, that window looks very ripe right now. And long term, the models of something like Plan B stock to flow ratio, if you believe in that, allegedly, or maybe for educational purposes, even at these levels, I think it's still like a 5-to-1 type move from the upcoming leveling off of the stock to flow ratio. I think it was something like 100K. And so that could propel further investment and interest into something like a Bitcoin just because of its total market cap. Because right now it's too small for a lot of these large institutions to take a serious position in. And I mean, for yourself and myself, I mean, 20,000 seems maybe like a lot of money. But on an overall market cap perspective, Bitcoin is still not even topped the largest companies um, on the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones. And so when you kind of put things into perspective, if this is going to be the digital store of value of the entire world, you're really still in the very early days of this network, really building out, growing, getting massive adoption. And so you're just going to continue to see ebbs and flows and growth pains, in my opinion. But the hash wars is something to keep your eye on. I think Block One's aware of this. I actually think Block One. I'll go this far, and this is more allegedly speculation, but I think Block One is actively working with the likes of many in the government to help educate them on these types of issues because there is so much lack of education, especially within government, especially within the congressional levels, to understand really what is going on and what is what. And so when you start to understand the potential implications of national security and the need for hashing power on a network that potentially controls the world in the future, I think folks may start to change their tune, um, who control rules and regulations here, but not only change their tune, they may actually even give a hand, right, to these companies to help them out. I mean, because don't forget, I mean, Block One is probably one of the few, if not the only, real, um, I would say, United States large public, I would say large company that's supporting a public blockchain like we're seeing outside of something like Ethereum. And so, there's a lot of considerations there and trade offs. But I think that what I got from that video was this realization of taking a step back and really looking to catch up with the likes of China. So we'll have to see and continue to monitoring that. On the China side, and how it relates to EOS is we've seen this BSN network, which is this blockchain services network that is sort of a tie-in within China for developers there to develop their applications and tie into public permissionless networks like EOS and Ethereum. So that those that didn't know that, that was released. I think it was released in the third week of September, and Ethereum and EOS are the two. There may be a few others that are listed there to allow these other companies or within China to kind of tie in some of the logic into these public chains. Now, it obviously goes through this umbrella or curtain that China's created with their BSN, which arguably may lead to some censorship, but nevertheless, it looks like China is kind of taking this first leap forward for many different countries in providing these tools and services, I think some of which are free of charge, to encourage the innovation and the development of applications on this network and actually to take it global. So again, when we look at the likes of national security, we're not only talking about something like Bitcoin and hashing power. We're looking at overall, now China's looking at developing this blockchain services network, so blockchains as a service, and giving that to folks all over the world, not just in China. And so if something like that starts to go across the world and people start to use it because they're offering these free services and maybe some other incentives, who knows, it just starts to give maybe one country more control, more power. It gives the people more dependency on that entity and more control over them. And so really you have to, let's hope that the United States starts to get this, and hopefully Block One is also making that case. So I don't know what you guys think about that. I know that was a lot just for that first piece of today's news. Again, one is the Google BP getting in the paid block producer position, still has a backup, but still significant. And two, this blockchain services network, which we haven't heard a lot about, but seems to be aggressive in terms of its position. So I know we have some comments here. I'm just going to go through this before we get into the next topic. So Mastermind says, things are moving fast. Glad to see you're back. EOS is finally showing some signs of life. It is to some extent. I mean, obviously this push up you're seeing as more larger macro market sentiment versus EOS specific, I would argue. So we're still waiting to see, I think, some of those moves by Block One and other large entities within the ecosystem to help propel this to something more EOS driven, where there's actually some real technical breakthroughs, or perhaps the network itself, as a community, we're able to overcome some of the shortcomings we've had with the likes of resources, which is our next topic. So there is some hurdles there, and let's not get it twisted. That's what we're going to talk about today, and I think it's important to have that narrative, that fabric, as a community, to keep it 100%, and just not to assume that just because from some respects you have better technology, that people are just going to automatically buy your coin. And we've learned a lot over the past couple of years. So that's kind of what today's topic is going to be about. And I'm trying to help help support that narrative. The likes of a Zach Gall, Everything EOS. Shout out to this guy who shows up. The power showing up, and that we were asked about recently. I think Dan Larimer had a question about what gives the community value, and that value goes beyond just producing code. The value is also about showing up, and one of the more interesting characters I think in this whole crypto space, if you haven't checked him out, is like the likes of a guy like Michael Saylor. I mean, you want to talk about going deep down the rabbit hole and really, I think, honing in on the philosophical arguments as to why something like Bitcoin is valuable, what you can do with it, why it's better than other alternatives. And it just, at least for me, crystallized so many of the things that many people have said, but sort of condensed that and articulated it in a way that I find very refreshing and very unique. So I don't know if you guys have had a chance to watch the video Bitcoin is Hope, but go ahead and check that out. I mean, that was some very interesting stuff. So moving on to the comments here, MH says EOS will flip F. I mean, Ether, we'll see about that. Captain James, what's going on? He says he agrees the mining wars are coming. The hash rate will be astronomical, and by the time the globe gets hash greedy, we'll be rich. I mean, we'll see about it. It is going to be, interesting to see that derivation in potentially something like a Bitcoin, or even if it was 10% of the overall world's wealth, then you're probably right. Now we'll just have to see how that evolves, and there's probably a low time preference type perspective that's needed. I mean, right now, a lot of people, maybe in the next couple years, you say, well, what can I buy with that Bitcoin? Maybe you can buy for one Bitcoin a very nice house. But maybe over many years, you can take a fraction of that Bitcoin and buy a very nice house, right? So it's like Bitcoin actually allows, in my opinion, the deflation of assets that naturally evolve in the world, whereas fiat supply, because it's ever increasing, the value of that asset, even though it's aging or even though it's not really changing, the price of that asset is just astronomically increasing. So there is a compelling reason for an average Jane or Joe to consider something like Bitcoin just from that perspective, because it forces assets that should basically deflate to do so, just because of the inherent nature and limited supply of Bitcoin. Viz is on the chat here. What's up, Viz? Carlita's Way says, my last video had no sound, and I apologize about that, but hopefully I'm on right now. And so with that being said, guys, the next topic is more just about, like, I guess, honing in more about that, what makes something valuable. And so I guess one of the things I was kind of curious about is hearing from you guys obviously we have Bitcoin, and that's sort of like fire, right? And so Bitcoin as utility, just like fire was for human beings, and still to this day, there's so many things that we can do with it. Well, what can you do with fire? You can create a power system, right? In a sense, if you have fuel and you can create enough heat, you can actually create energy, right? So you can use fire to protect your community, right? You can use it to provide a light at night. And so you can take the day and basically extend it by a factor of 2, right? So you're gaining this order of efficiency, and you're able to cook food with it, for example, right? And improve your consumption of the meal because of the digestive process, or the I guess the way the food evolves as it's cooked, and the nutrients. So there's all these things that fire, that's heat, and that's, you get orders of improvements in terms of your life, does. And so Bitcoin obviously has sort of, in the last couple of, I would say last couple of years, but some could argue more recently than that, there's been some very firm arguments to suggest that Bitcoin is that store of value. So now that that's been established, we look at these other networks and possibly what they can do, right? And so what would Ethereum do, for example? And maybe Ethereum, the argument is, that's DeFi central, and they're also working on scalability. And maybe a lot of that is true. Maybe it's not. Um, you get maybe more security there with the trade off of performance, right? In some ways, at least for now. And so, again, everything is trade offs, just like in engineering. I think there's no right or wrong answer. It's not a binary argument. You're going to have pros and cons to anything. What do you get with EOS, for example? And so that's where I'm kind of at. I'm kind of reevaluating why EOS, right? Why would a developer, and so why would a developer want to understand or program on EOS? That is today's question, guys. And so Block One has done some good work recently in releasing some EOS training and certification. I'm actually going through that myself. I don't know about if you guys are going through that. I'd encourage you to. But one of the things that is a fair criticism or a fair argument is, why would someone want to learn about EOSIO? The fact that today, if we look at metrics that a normal analyst would use. So if I was an analyst maybe covering a space, and I am sort of a unofficial, I guess, homie analyst for you guys, right? I mean, no one pays us to be out here or do things. I mean, we just do it because part of the community is showing up, right? That's what sort of gives community value, is you having that fabric of other people around you who provide services, maybe provide applications. In my real job, it is actually providing a service, right? It's providing power. It's providing reliable power designs or systems, analyzing different systems, building controls, right? These are all services that society needs, that we wouldn't function without them. I mean, imagine if there was no power in your community, how long would it take you to basically go up and riot and demand something be done? Okay, versus something like you lose maybe the ability to use Uber. I mean, those are orders of magnitude different, right? But taking it back to, I guess, the utility of EOS and why. And so I think that's sort of the challenge that Block One and EOS as a community have right now, because it's not enough to have an improved technology from a code base perspective. It's not enough to have that. It's not enough to boast about having $4 billion, because the reality is, as much as OGs and indies like to posture and think that $4 billion is a lot of money, in the grand scheme of things, most banks have billions of dollars, and $4 billion is just a rounding error to them. So $4 billion doesn't mean jack shit. And I know that a lot of people may take offense to that, but that's the reality. So, but recently Block One has taken a stance to provide a training and certification program, which is awesome. And Peter K nails it. So they have that going for them. If we look at metrics, and we were an analyst on Wall Street covering blockchain technologies, and someone asked us to understand or track the growth in something like EOS, what is one of the things that we're going to look at? Well, naturally, we're going to look at a couple different things. One is, how many jobs are there available where EOSIO as a blockchain technology is in demand? And so we don't see right now jobs requiring EOSIO software, knowledge, development. We're not seeing that. We've seen a couple from Voice and Block.one, but outside those projects, we're not seeing organic interest from commercial companies to actually want to have or need to have EOSIO yet. So, in my opinion, from that, the job of marketing EOSIO is just not been there, or the case hasn't been successfully made, because in order to do that, in my opinion, you actually have to see metrics that are measurable that show that companies outside of donations that were given to an entity, um, you actually have demand for a good or service. If I was, building a substation or a power system, and or if I was and I am an engineer, and I had no demand for my services, that would be a bad sign. That would probably mean that I'm not doing my job. Um, my architecture is not needed. And so when we start to look at EOSIO as a solution that solves problems, part of that is actually seeing demand. And so I think that is sort of a problem, because you have a chicken and egg problem. So we have the knowledge, I think, improving, and there's formal, seems like training and certification, which again I'm a part of, but you're not really seeing the other side of it, which is, hey, we actually need to have this technology. We're willing to pay people to provide this service to us, and this is why it's valuable to us. And so we need to have those compelling reasons start to enter the narrative and the fabric within not only the blockchain space, but overall across society. And maybe a part of that for many of you guys, and even for myself initially, my thought process was voice was going to provide and illustrate that framework in some way to show how EOSIO could be used, and how it would talk possibly to the EOS network, the mainnet network, because that is the source of truth, in some ways. Source of scalable truth is what I'm going to call it, right? Because you have something like, you have the likes of a Bitcoin, which is a digital store of value. It is not there to handle thousands of transactions or hundreds of thousands of transactions per second. EOS was formed at the forefront. It's in its DNA was this thesis, this idea that we would be able to scale to thousands of transactions per second with hundreds of dApps on a network. And so that is the value proposition of an EOS. And why would someone want to work on something like that? Well, if you have hundreds of users, if you not hundreds of users, you have thousands, millions of users, right? You have millions of users, billions of users all around the world. Your cost for user acquisition is basically reduced by a substantial factor, maybe a factor of a tenth or a hundredth of what it would be on a different type of non-open source, non-permissionless network. Take Facebook, for example, right? Facebook, it's not free to advertise. It's not free to just interact with anybody. It costs money to do that. So if you had potentially a network within the EOSIO ecosystem that had millions or billions of users, you can start to make an argument that, well, me as an enterprise business that interfaces with customers, I have the opportunity to get exposure to those customers, but at a fractionalized cost of what I would do with the traditional technology. That would be a very compelling argument to me to be interested in, from a business perspective, building something on EOS. But again, that takes users on the network. So you have something like voice, and maybe that is the analogy to what Bitcoin is, what Fire is to Bitcoin. Maybe voice and maybe EOS is this reputational network. And so I don't know if that is what the argument may be. And I'm not talking about EOSIO, because you can take the open source software and adapt it to any utility that you have an interest in. But even if you search EOSIO, you haven't seen the job listings for developers. So to me, there isn't the demand yet for it. So I'm kind of curious to see how even someone like a Block One, if there's a pivot that's needed at this point. And the only reason why I say this is because normally in engineering, like for projects like I take on, and obviously they're a lot smaller than this and they're in a different domain, but normally if things aren't going right, or you have metrics, you have metrics that you look at, you evaluate um, performances, right? And if things aren't going the way you expected, they don't meet your criteria, then it's important to actually decide to pivot, and then that may be needed. But right now, taking EOS out of the picture, because I know Carlitos, wait, I'm going to get to his comment here. Taking that out of the picture, even the demand for EOSIO, we haven't seen that. So I don't think that, again, the argument's been made. But maybe guys, maybe something like a voice is water for, like what fire is to Bitcoin, water is to EOS. Maybe it's that type of analogy where now you have this sovereign identity layer on something like Bitcoin, or on something like EOS. And that merges with something like Bitcoin, which is a store of value. So now you have created water and fire, and together they can do some amazing things, right? And I don't know what that time frame is or what that looks like, but I think a part of it has to be community fabric and organic interest from the homies that listen to this channel, and for a lot of the plebs that listen to this channel, like myself, right? I mean, we're plebs in this case, but even if you look at something like Bitcoin in its beginnings had crazies, had plebs, right? And you needed to have that. You needed to have the community. You needed to have the discussions. You needed to have someone, people communicate and make the case, make the philosophical case, be willing to stake their reputation on the line, whether they were companies, individuals, groups, right, of people that came in and had enough courage to do that. And even recently with Bitcoin, you've seen that. You've seen the likes of a Michael Saylor. You've seen the Stanley Druckenmillers start to really make the case for Bitcoin. And so you kind of wonder, going back to Dan Larimer's analogy of eating our own dog food, I have yet to really see or understand that from a commercial standpoint. And I'm curious if or what we'll see, and how, so this is a network system. EOS is a network, and EOSIO is the underpinning software that powers this mainnet and other chains. But these are all social networks. And so, yes, price is important. Yes, code is important. Yes, maybe $4 billion is important for one company, but that doesn't make the value of a network. That's not what made, that's not what made Bitcoin valuable. If it was all about code and $4 billion, someone could be, in theory, recreate Bitcoin, I guess, right? And go and try to get people interested in that. But it's not. It's more. It's about the proof of work, I call it, right? And this is something from Michael Saylor. When people think of proof of work, they think of the Bitcoin network and its computational hash power. And that's true. And we talked about that earlier in this video. But part of proof of work is also the people, right? The people that are actually working on understanding the network, spending time on the network, talking about the network to their communities, cultivating the network. You think of someone like Zach Gall. You think of Peter Kay before he joined Block One. You think of Mark Woods, maybe, who supported this June 1st event. And there have been many others. You can even go to the Gang, right? And Rob Finch, for example, who left the community. And so that to me is a form of proof of work because, and let me explain why. Uh, when you have those types of things, initially, and maybe even right now, someone could argue, EOS is very hard to understand. It's very hard to understand why someone would be interested in EOS or EOSIO because of its complications with resources and keys and management, and maybe it's easy for someone like Dan Larimer to understand, but my message would be that we have some really smart people at Block One, but it's important to sort of take a step back and recognize that a lot of people are not Dan Larimer. The average person isn't a Dan Larimer. And in order for this project to be successful, it needs to be with community. It needs to be with people who have the skill set to break concepts down. It needs to be with talent that can abstract the complication of the network in some ways, to distill the information to its essential components for different types of community, right? To consume that information. And so proof of work is really the Zach Galls, the Gangs, the Rob Finches, the people who show up and actually perform a proof of work because they're able to invest the time to understand the technology and distill it and computate in their minds and basically distribute that to the world on something like YouTube. And by doing that, it allows the subsequent people who are understanding or listening to that information, it helps them to also process that information, and it allows them to do it at a much more efficient rate. So whereas it would have taken someone like myself several months maybe, and I'm not a dumb guy, but maybe it might take me, 2 months to understand something by listening to a guy like Rob Finch or Zach Gall distilling it, every week like they had done, like they were doing. That basically allowed me to leverage their proof of work. In effect, they were mining the network, right? So it's not like, computationally you can't prove that, but there is a network effect. There was an impact on the value. There's an impact on the interest of this. And you're seeing that in Bitcoin too, because again, people just think, oh, proof of work with the computational hash power, and that is true. But you also have the Michael Saylors, you have the Cyber Hornets that make up that system. You have the Saifedeans of the world. You have the Pomplianos of the world, right? And you have all these people who are adamant and basically warriors, Marines of this network. And so my challenge is, how do we, or my thinking right now is, how do you galvanize or basically reward those people, or at least recognize their work, because they've been showing up for 3 years now. And oftentimes there's been some other teams like Scatter who made their wallet and got dished up, in my opinion, some comments from folks at Block One that, could have been perceived in a certain way. And I guess with the understanding that a lot of these teams haven't really received funding, it just comes across very disingenuous and very distant between the teams. And so it is really the antithesis of alignment of incentives. And so I think really the first step of it is, well, there's two things I think that need to happen in my opinion. One is communication, and I'm not talking about Twitter because that's like an ivory tower. Really, it's showing up in the community making videos, being vulnerable. Being vulnerable is I think one of the most strongest actions humans can do to prove that they care, right? I mean, you think about your relationships, right? And so when you get into serious relationships, you have to admit, and you're probably nodding your head right now, one of the things that happens is you get very vulnerable with the people you work with. That is part of it. But it also means just acknowledging that maybe you were wrong, and it's okay to do that. And I know as engineers and maybe people in certain disciplines, it's hard to do that. But I think just having a clearing of the air would be even more valuable than money being thrown as a first step. But the sentiment that we get right now, and this is just taking the temperature around the community, isn't very good based on the recent comments from certain individuals. And so while the tech is great and while the code base is improving, you actually need this fabric of people, because code is code and people are people, but people can elect what to do with their time and what type of proof of work they want to form, because we're all performing an element of proof of work. You watching this channel today is a form of proof of work, and I want to thank you for that, because you have other options. There's opportunity cost. You could decide to support and follow the Bitcoin network, or maybe you do both. You could work at a job and make money right now as we speak. You could be learning a code base. But you've elected to come here and listen to EOS talk. And so I guess my point is, I think as a first step, hopefully those that have influence at Block One, and hopefully some of the homies at Block One watch this video. I think if there is some type of a heart-to-heart communication soon, like before the end of this year, that puts and crystallizes this and recognizes those individuals, and it's not myself, because I don't show up all the time, but there has been individuals that do show up all the time, and provides a way that gives them at least the recognition that they deserve, and provides some type of a path that the community can work with, be one on, and forge forward in. Because right now, the way it is, it's very chaotic, but not even in a decentralized way. It's almost like, let's slap you in the face, and while we're at it, let's kick you on the ground. And that to me isn't the kind of way to build up your troops or make a movement that is positive, or alignment incentives, or do anything that was discussed at or prior to the ICO. It's actually the very opposite of what you want to do. So again, throw the money aside. Even just starting with basic human communication and empathy, and saying, we hear you, we recognize you, we thank you for showing up. That would be a huge thing, and it would be a good first step. So, I mean, that's kind of where I stand, guys. That's what I wanted to share with you guys today. I think that is the number one thing on the EOS network. It's not about the price. It is about the respect and showing up. And I think if we can get Block One, and if we can get other people to show up every week, you're going to see results. You're not going to feel like showing up. You're going to continue to disrespect certain people. The community is just going to implode, and there's other options. So, that's my opinion about where things stand, and this is just that's just natural law. That's just natural fundamental elements of how you become a leader. You don't become a leader by putting individuals down, or acting like one person knows more than the other. Some of it is just saying, listen, I don't know, or this is just my opinion. And sometimes in life, and I've seen this, I've lived in a lot of interesting situations, I'll put it that way, and so sometimes it's easy being on one side and thinking the other side is wrong, and vice versa. And so I want to give Block One and others the benefit of the doubt. Have there been some, decisions that have been made that haven't been good? Probably. And in hindsight, we could all say that we would do XYZ a certain way. But what is more, I guess, what is truth and what no one can argue with is we're here today and there's a choice on how we want to do things tomorrow. And so if folks have an intention to do things a different way tomorrow, there's still an ability to do that and probably turn out really well, because it still, in my opinion, I don't think Ethereum has made the case that they're ready to scale or they figured all this out. And so we're at a really interesting crossroads to see how this network evolves. And so I'm just going to read a couple questions here that have come through, or a couple comments that have come through. Carlito's Way says the non-responsiveness of Dan and Brendan about their promises for the EOS mainnet on Twitter and Telegram is making the EOS community angry. I think so. I think some of that, though, is potentially SEC related, regulations related. And so you could be seeing a quiet period on that. What I don't like seeing, so I don't, like me personally, I don't, not that the non-responsiveness is good, but what's even more concerning is the bashing of different projects. And I think if you're not, if you don't have something good to say, just don't say it. It's pretty simple. That's a really basic rule, especially if you're not yourself producing that product or service. Really don't have any position to talk about it, irrespective of who you are. And so, like, that's sort of the crux of the matter, but especially if you're a leader, whether you recognize you're a leader or not, it's important to, I think through your communication style before you dump something on somebody. And so that, I think, is a demonstration of the immaturity of some individuals that, while maybe intellectually and in some facets of technical understanding are amazing and good and top notch, maybe, or well recognized in the industry, it shows that maybe certain individuals maybe lack certain skills in other ways, and they have a lot to grow in. And hopefully in the next year we can see that growth, but that could also hinder this community from feeling confident, feeling there's an alignment of incentives, feeling like there's any incentive to do it, right? Why would you even build something if potentially it's just going to be shot down? There's no interest maybe even rewarding or supporting these people, right? That could help hopefully grow the network overall, right? And so I really don't know what that's about, but I guess that's something that individual should clarify. And so this says it's the oxygen, and I would agree with you. It is the oxygen. Bogo Shop says you should take up torch and rally the troops. I mean, that's what these things are about, guys. I mean, it's about just trying to show up and have a discussion with you guys, give you guys the news, give you guys my thoughts, not, compensated by anybody, just like a homie, a pleb, if you will. An EOS pleb is what I am. And just trying to speak up for the voiceless. So Johnny says NS James and Scatter deserve a lot of respect in EOS, and that's what I'm talking about. I mean, I think about before, pre-scatter and post-scatter, and just how clunky a lot of things were. And I'm not saying it's perfect. It's not perfect by any means, but I mean, it was sufficient to do pretty much what we needed to do at this point in time. And scatter, arguably even isn't even the reason why we've had the frustration we've had with using or evaluating the technology of EOS. I think it's been more this issue with resources and the time frames with overcoming these hurdles with the resource model when the EIDOS type project was introduced on the network. And so there's been, as you guys may know, some discussions about transitioning this into pools of staking, and also transitioning the resources from more of this ownership model to a rental model. And and I think what possibly could be seen in a lot of this is inevitably a whack-a-mole type situation, right? With control, with different types of systems like these, very complex systems. When you have a complex system, you think you've solved one aspect of the problem, and you probably have, but because of the introduction of new variables or new components within that system, it inevitably leads to something unknown being now a new problem. And so it takes, I think it takes a unique process. It takes a more collaborative and more transparent process, not only for the block producers that are active, but for the community and for the leaders of the network to help shape and frame and communicate in that we just haven't seen. And so it really remains to be seen if that's going to change, because I don't personally believe that, and I've never seen this in my career doing what I do, which is a lot more simpler than building this network. But normally, when you have a problem and you solve it with some code, or you solve a control system and you evaluate it, you find the root cause, or you think you know the issue, you patch it, or you do something different, it's very hard to know by doing that change, by implementing that change, what other aspects of the system are impacted. What's the edge cases that you haven't considered? And so again, the correct attitude to have is inevitably we're going to have those issues that do come up. You're going to have ripples that maybe aren't even known. And it's more about how you respond to them as a team. How do you work together with your counterparts on the eastern side of the world or the west side, and how do you show the world that you are number one? Because in order to be number one, in order to be like the Michael Jordan of the blockchain space, you have to be at that level. You have to be the top-notch level. You have to convince people all the time, not just in 2018, not just when you were launching the network. You have to convince people all the time that you're number one, that you have a standard that is almost unrivaled, almost unparalleled. Like almost nobody could out defeat you, right, in some way. And so in the 2018 timeframe, in that launch timeframe, we saw the likes of EOS New York make that standard, in my opinion. Now, I don't really like a lot of, okay, maybe I don't want to go there, but it doesn't maybe have to do with whether I like people on EOS New York or not, but my point is whether I like them or not doesn't matter. What matters is that they set the standard during that process, and that formed, if you remember, the foundation. It formed the fabric of how the block producing campaigning was done at launch, if you remember. So they were really the first team to lay out that framework, that standard, that communication, that openness with the community. And you saw a lot of the block producers around the world do that. And so since then, the standards and the framework and the fabric has been lost, or it's been deteriorated to the point where I personally don't know who the block producers are in the East Coast, or in the eastern side of the world. I don't really know them. I don't know who those block producers are. I don't know why they want to do, I don't know what they have to do with EOS. Is it just a job for you? And so maybe that sounds kind of harsh, but that's what this show's about. It's about keeping it 100, because the Bitcoin OGs or the Bitcoin miners, they're the type of individuals that they're cyber hornets. They're going to show up for the network, and they're going to fight to the death. And for EOS, in order to be top-notch, you have to meet that standard. You have to be unparalleled. And not knowing the philosophy of these block producers, given the risk and um, trade-offs with this network, part of the way in which EOS works is reputation on this network. Really, it's a federated chain, right? So we're voting for these miners effectively, but there's only 21 of them. So the weight of trust on the network is much more significant than it would be on a different type of blockchain system. And so really the value, the proof of reputation, if you will, on something like EOS, it's much more important than it is on another chain. But by the block producers in my book, from my perspective, and this is just my opinion, so it may not be your opinion, and I respect that, but because of that inherent nature of what it is, yeah, reputation and what the hell you're doing every day or what you're doing to grow the network, your allegiance to the EOS network means everything. And this may also offend some people, but in my opinion, I also think that the delusion, the delusion of some BPs to work across different chains may have led to some loss of focus on the mainnet. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you're going to run other chains, other networks, that takes time and resources away from the chain I'm interested in. And while I have no beef with the other chains, I don't have any beef with the Wax chain or the Telos chain or whatever the hell chain it is, I care about the EOS network. I don't care about the Wax network. I don't wish any harm against it, but it doesn't do anything for me. It's not my why. I'm here for the EOS network. And so I want to know what the BPs have been doing for the EOS network. And that goes to all the top 21. In fact, I've now started to, and I'm putting this out there, look at, I want BPs that are exclusively focused on the BPs that are exclusively focused on the EOS network. I don't want BPs that are off doing other shit, because the reality of the situation is EOS network fails, these other chains fail. These other EOS IO chains fail. There's no need for them, there's no liquidity, and frankly, no one gives a shit outside the EOS niche ecosystem. So I think there needs to be sort of a refocus, a recoil of strategy and focus, and that's what I'm looking for in a BP, not going off and doing some other bullshit that frankly doesn't matter. So let's see about the time frame for fixing the resource issues. Let's see reports on the benchmark testing for the proposed changes. Let's see more videos showing up and showing your allegiance to the network. Let's see more videos showing the reputation of these block producers and what their vision is for the EOS network. It has a lot more to do with just minimally meeting the requirements of producing a block. If I wanted a blockchain, if I wanted a system like that, I can use Amazon Web Services. I can use Amazon Web Services, and I can use a US stable dollar coin and make my application on there. That's not what EOS is about. So if you don't really have the same vision as a block producer, you really should just get off the network and go to these clown chains, or go get paid off by somebody and make your money that way. So I'm gonna get some comments here. So Carlito says, when they restart to communicate daily about the mainnet, the sentiment has the only one way to go, up. That's probably true. Johnny says, NS James and Scott deserve a lot of respect. That is true. Adventures in Randomness agrees. Carlitos Way asks if they could just tell us if this was the SEC. Why don't they? I don't think we'll ever actually know. And Johnny says B1 needs to be disciplined. They know they're getting negativity from the community, but if their plan works and seems ambitious, Block 1 and the EOS community will benefit tremendously. And then Johnny says EOS, IO Network, and Ethereum hate on EOS too, and I kind of like it. Well, I mean, the only thing, Johnny, about that is it's nice to maybe like it, but the problem with it is, so EOS as an ecosystem is pretty niche. EOS IO as an ecosystem is pretty niche. And so if you think about it, you have a couple, I would say, core 100 or core 1,000 people that are across these chains. And so my argument is, if you think about it like a proof of work, each human being has only so much time in the day to spend or allocate towards different things. And if you're spending your allocation towards a wax, you're spending your allocation towards Telos, you're spending your allocation towards a Warbly or whatever the fuck these networks are. And it's no disrespect to them, but you look at the liquidity, being an OG, and these networks are shit because there's no liquidity, there's no movement of dollars in them. So they're basically going to go to zero or fail, potentially. There's a high risk of it, high chance of it. And meanwhile, all that energy could have been focused in improving the core aspects of EOS and getting the framework and community fabric dialed in and galvanize a whole community of developers and incentivize, the growth that you need to see. And so I think a lot of the EOS lack of growth is the doing of people within our own community, thinking like, well, I'll just go off and build this thing, But I look at the liquidity of these again, and nothing against Telos, but there's just no liquidity there. So you can't actually, you can have the best code, but code doesn't, code by yourself is not really valuable. So that's why you don't see forks of Bitcoin doing well, because it doesn't have the network effect. And an average Jane or Joe isn't going to carry hundreds of EOSIO coins. It's not going to happen. So get it out of your head. Focus in on maybe having EOS succeed. Figure out how to scale it. Make the argument for sovereign identity. Water for EOS like fire is to Bitcoin. And that's really how you're going to be successful. So a lot of these chains have no money. They have no real money. They have no liquidity. So they can't market their products. They have no users. So again, dumb move in my opinion. Really dumb move. And I know I'm going to get some heat for that, but that's the reality. You got to have devotion and loyalty. And that's right, Viz. You got to show up, and I'd like to see those block producers actually do that, or just get out. And at this point, it's not really enough incentive for me. I know there's these DeFi projects and EOS Nation proxy. At this point, it is more of a focus on block producers that are going to devote and show loyalty as a cyber hornet to support EOS as their core focus. Start showing up to do community events, communicate what the fuck they're doing, and those are going to be the ones that get my vote. And I would encourage you guys to do the same thing, because the reality is the APRs, the giveaways you're seeing on these other proxies, they're a waste of time, because what ends up happening is they actually extract value. They extract your long-term value, because you see, when you vote for these shitty proxies that vote in shitty BPs that do minimal work, shit long term doesn't get done. So you have a network that has minimal, I guess, minimal functioning. Yeah, the BPs, they produce blocks. Look at your time frame on your improvements to the network. You're going to wait 3 additional months to figure out your freaking resource models, and there's been no real transparent priorities shown, no energy, no real motivating energy from this team of BPs to figure out how the heck this is supposed to work and acceleration of time frame to get the job done. To me, that's bullshit. So it tells me that EOS isn't even worth holding. If that's the Cyber Hornet BPs, if that's the best we have for Cyber Hornet BPs, that to me is not enough to hold EOS. So what I'm interested in seeing is BPs that are going to show up, be Marines, stick their reputation on the line, get an accelerated time frame. I'm interested in seeing Block 1 show up as well, or else this is a waste of time, and frankly, you're better off in Bitcoin is my opinion. At least there's a community there of Cyber Hornets. So you could tell that to Douglas Horn of Telos, because just look at that liquidity is all I can say. It tells the whole story. There's no money there, no funding. So Carlita says we have to promote that everyone takes off their EOS off exchanges and magically everything in BP is solved. That is probably true, but there's again those proxies and focus on what BPs are there as cyber BPs to engineer the updates that are needed on the network. I think the latest update, guys, and I don't know if you saw that, was like 60 days or something. What is that, like 2 months? I'm not going to wait another 2 months for a plan on resource updates. You know, this is the type of thing that EOS in its DNA was built for. So to see this type of lagging timeframes on work tells me that those BPs are not cyber BPs. They're not in it to win it. They're doing this as a job. Block 1 not showing up for community events. Idle comments on Twitter. I don't know. It just tells me they are looking at this as a job and it's not their passion. And there's a difference there with, I think, when you want something to succeed, the type of attitude you take, your mindset, the ability to show up, the ability to make comments, to show up in events and be vulnerable. And we haven't really seen that from the likes of Dan Larimer. So until that happens, guys, you know, while EOS is an interesting, it's an interesting technology play. Like, I'm not sure if, like, you guys would feel comfortable telling, like, your mom or your family about it, right? To hold it, or to explain to them that they're cyber hornets that stake their reputation on the line to the point where they're willing to battle with anybody who F's with the network. That's the kind of mindset I'm looking for. And frankly, we haven't seen that. So I'll continue to make my videos, guys. I'll continue to cover the space, but I just figured I'd give you guys my take on where things are at with EOS. My intent to vote in the Google BP because, in my opinion, it's YOLO. We have nothing to lose. And vote off the other BPs, or not vote for many of them, maybe some indie BPs, because frankly, I don't think that the current BPs, or I haven't seen communications from them. I don't know who many of them are. And so I think it's time to shake things up. I hope the large holders out there join me in shaking things up. And let's see what happens. So with that said, guys, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. Go out for a run. Hope everybody's doing well out there, staying healthy. And until next time, guys, this is Phoenix signing off. Peace.